For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. It feels like it's still being asked, right now, about us. So, we're going to ask it plainly. Is the Middle East moving toward Bible prophecy? Before dawn this week, missiles and artillery fell on Najran, a quiet border province in southern Saudi Arabia. 11 civilians were wounded. One of them was 4 years old. In the hours that followed, Houthi forces struck deeper into Yemen itself. Marib, Hadramaut, and intelligence services in 3 separate countries began warning of something larger taking shape, a coordinated front, stitched together by Iran, running from Yemen through Iraq toward a single uneasy neighbor. Here is the only question we are here to answer tonight. Is the Middle East moving toward Bible prophecy? 25 centuries ago, a prophet named Zechariah wrote that Jerusalem would become a cup that makes the surrounding nations stagger, a stone so heavy that anyone who tries to lift it only wounds themselves in the attempt. Watch this week's footage, and that image stops sounding like poetry. It starts sounding like a forecast. But before we answer, it's worth admitting something uncomfortable. The Middle East is not the only place shaking right now. In Ukraine, a war now closing in on its 5th year ground through its bloodiest month, yet this July, the highest casualty count of the entire year, for a rate of advance Kremlin officials themselves have described as barely faster than walking pace. In the South China Sea, Chinese and Philippine vessels have collided, rammed, and struck one another with batons near a reef called Second Thomas Shoal, while Japan, for the first time since the Second World War, has sent combat troops into the region to stand alongside its allies. And underneath all of it, quietly reshaping the region we're about to examine, sits the war between Israel and Iran that has run since February. 4 fronts, 4 fires, lit within months of each other on nearly opposite sides of the planet. It would be easy to conclude the world has simply always been this way, restless, forgetful, lighting the next war before the ashes of the last one cool. And there is truth in that. We are not going to pretend otherwise. But tonight, we are not going to look at all 4 fires. We are going to look at the one place the Bible insists on returning to by name. For reasons that have nothing to do with this morning's headline, we are going to look at the Middle East. Because if there is an answer to tonight's question anywhere on this earth, the text says, we will find it here first. To understand why, we have to go back to a man who owned no land at all. His name was Abram. He left a city called Ur with no heir, and a single promise ringing in his ears, that he would father a great nation, and that a particular stretch of ground would belong to his descendants for as long as the story ran. Abram had sons. Ishmael, born through Hagar, his wife's servant, sent into the wilderness once the tension in that household grew unbearable. Isaac, born through Sarah herself in her old age, long after hope had quietly stopped asking. Ishmael's own sons became 12 tribal nations scattered across Arabia. One of them was named Kedar. Hold on to that name, it returns. There is a 3rd branch of this family that rarely survives the retelling. After Sarah's death, Abraham married again to a woman named Keturah and had more sons. Two of them were named Sheba and Dedan. Their descendants settled the Arabian Peninsula in the territory we now call Yemen and northern Saudi Arabia. That is not a footnote. Sheba and Dedan do not disappear from the record. They return, centuries later, inside two of the most specific prophecies the Bible contains. Set exactly where this week's headlines are being written, so hold three names quietly in your mind tonight. Kedar, Sheba, Dedan. Israel descends from Isaac. A wide stretch of Arabia descends from Ishmael through Kedar. And Yemen, along with the northern reaches of Saudi Arabia, trace back to Sheba and Dedan. This is not background information offered for atmosphere. This is the family tree standing quietly underneath tonight's news. What the prophets did with that family tree centuries later is more exact than almost anyone expects. Before we get there, if you're the kind of person who would rather understand what's actually written than simply react to a headline, that's what this channel is for. Subscribe now. It costs you nothing, and it means the next chapter of this finds you before the next missile does. Now we arrive at the text that matters most tonight, not Revelation. A chapter most readers skip entirely, Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. Writing from exile in Babylon in the 6th century before Christ, Ezekiel describes a coalition of nations gathering against Israel in the last days, led by a figure called Gog, from a land called Magog. And then the prophet does something ancient literature almost never does. He names names. The coalition includes Persia. It includes Cush and Put. It includes Gomer and Beth Togarmah. Persia is not a riddle. It is the literal, historical name of the nation we call Iran today. A name the country carried officially until 1935, when its own government asked the world to call it something else. Cush maps to ancient Nubia, roughly modern Sudan. Put is generally placed in Libya or along the northeast African coast. Gomer and Beth Togarmah sit in Anatolia, modern Turkey. Read plainly, this is a coalition anchored by Iran, drawing in Sudan, Libya, and Turkey. And Ezekiel adds a detail about timing that most readers pass over entirely. This invasion happens after Israel has already been gathered back from among the nations, dwelling once again on land restored from war. For nearly 2,000 years, that description fit nothing at all. Israel did not exist as a state. It existed only as a memory, scattered across the earth, waiting for a geography to return to. But here is the detail almost no one talks about, and it is the one that matters most tonight. In the middle of naming this coalition, Ezekiel pauses for a strange aside. He writes that Sheba and Dedan, along with nearby merchants, will turn to the invaders and ask a pointed question. Have you come to seize plunder? Have you gathered this army to carry off loot? Sheba and Dedan are not named as part of the invasion. They are named as witnesses, watching, uneasy, standing at the edge of something they did not start. And Sheba and Dedan, as we just established, are the ancestral names of the exact territory we now call Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Set that beside this week's headlines, Iran, Ezekiel's Persia, is, by every intelligence assessment available, backing the Houthi movement in Yemen. Saudi Arabia, sitting on land once called Dedan, is the nation absorbing the missiles. If you were searching for a single passage that named, by ancestry, the exact triangle of nations dominating tonight's news, this is the one that is very hard to walk past. So let us be careful here, because this is exactly where enthusiasm tends to outrun the evidence. What Ezekiel describes is Gog's full coalition invading Israel directly, a sweeping multi-nation assault with consequences the text renders in cosmic terms. What actually happened this week was Houthi forces striking Saudi Arabia, not Israel. Iran is backing the aggressor here, not leading a declared war on Jerusalem. And Sheba and Dedan are not merely watching from a safe distance this time. Saudi Arabia is the one bleeding. So no, this is not Ezekiel 38 playing out scene for scene on the evening news. Anyone who tells you otherwise is reading the headline into the text, rather than reading the text against the headline. And church history carries a long, uncomfortable record of people making exactly that mistake, with dates, with wars, with world leaders, only to be proven wrong within a few embarrassing years. What we can say, more carefully, is this: the geography matches, the ancestry matches, the alignment of powers matches almost precisely what a text written 26 centuries ago described. Persia backing action near Sheba, Dedan under pressure. Israel watching from the sidelines with its defenses raised, occupying, even now, the same position it holds at the center of Ezekiel's account. The pieces on the board are the pieces the prophet named. Whether the game has begun or whether we are simply watching the same pieces return to their old positions, the way they seem to every few decades remains the real question. It is a question this text does not yet let us answer with certainty. There is one more piece of this week's map, and it is not happening in Yemen or Saudi Arabia at all. It is happening in a waterway most people have heard of, and few could point to on a globe. 150 miles from where the missiles fell this week sits the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and the passage for nearly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil. Since war broke out between the United States, Israel, and Iran in February, this strait has become the sharpest edge of the entire conflict. Iran has declared its own authority over who may pass. Its parliament is weighing a plan to ban American and Israeli vessels outright and toll everyone else until it is compensated for the war. Diplomats speak of a deal soon. Shipping analysts remain considerably less convinced. This anxiety is no longer confined to one gulf. Earlier this year, when Hormuz briefly closed, the shock reached the Philippines, thousands of miles away, pushing the country into a national energy emergency. Hormuz, the Red Sea, the South China Sea. These are no longer separate stories. They are becoming one nervous system, and the world is only beginning to feel it flinch as a whole. There is an old passage that speaks almost eerily to this exact fear. In Ezekiel 27, the prophet mourns the fall of Tyre, an ancient trading city so central to world commerce that the chapter reads like a shipping manifest, listing merchant partners, cargo, and routes, before describing the entire system collapsing in a single catastrophe, while sailors stand on the shore and weep for what the sea has taken. Centuries later, Revelation 18 echoes the same scene almost exactly, describing the fall of a trading power called Babylon. The merchants of the earth weeping, because no one buys their cargo anymore. and ship captains watching from a distance as an entire economy disappears within a single hour. No serious scholar claims either passage predicted a modern strait of oil tankers, but the shape of the fear is identical. A world grown wealthy on a narrow channel of trade, watching a handful of armed actors slowly realize they can close it whenever they choose. Ezekiel is not alone in naming this region. A century before him, the prophet Isaiah delivered a short, unsettling oracle called, in most translations, the burden of Arabia. It is easy to miss. Only a handful of verses tucked between longer prophecies about Babylon and Egypt. But it names specifically the family we have already been tracing. Isaiah describes caravans of Dedanites fleeing into the thickets of Arabia, escaping war. He calls on the people of Tema to bring water to the thirsty and bread to those fleeing the fighting. And then he names Kedar, Ishmael's grandson, the very name we set aside earlier, declaring that within a single year, counted precisely like the years of a hired worker's contract, the glory of Kedar would fade, its warriors and archers diminished. Set aside for a moment whether you read this as literal prediction. Notice only how specific it is, not the nations, spoken in some vague, sweeping sense. Dedan, Tema, Kedar, three tribal names tracing directly back to Ishmael and to Dedan, mapped almost exactly onto the Arabian Peninsula, making headlines tonight. Refugees. Caravans scattering into the wilderness. Water and bread carried out to people displaced by war. None of it would look out of place in this week's coverage out of Najran. Two prophets, writing in different centuries, under different circumstances, independently circling the same handful of ancestral names. Persia, Sheba, Dedan, Kedar, names first recorded in Genesis, long before either man ever picked up a pen. That is not one fortunate guess. That is a pattern, repeating itself with a persistence that starts to feel less like coincidence and more like design. And here, honestly, is where a fair-minded viewer should push back a little. Ukraine is also burning. The South China Sea is also tightening, month by month, incident by incident. Is the Middle East really special? Or are we simply choosing to notice one fire out of four because it happens to match a verse we already knew? It is a fair question. And Jesus, in one of the more understated passages of the New Testament, seems to have anticipated it directly. In Matthew 24, his disciples ask him plainly, "What sign will mark the end of the age?" His answer is almost anticlimactic. "You will hear of wars," he tells them, "and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. See that you are not alarmed. These," he says, "are only the beginning of birth pains." Read carefully. That is not a description of one region. It is a description of the whole world convulsing, repeatedly, long before any final chapter arrives. Ukraine fits comfortably inside that sentence. So does the South China Sea, where Filipino and Chinese vessels now collide with a regularity that has become almost routine, where a nation once quietly demilitarized now trains alongside troops it hasn't fielded abroad since 1945. So frankly, does most of recorded human history, if we are honest about how rarely the world has ever actually been at peace. But here is the distinction worth holding onto carefully in both hands. Nowhere does the Bible trace Ukraine's ancestry back to Abraham. Nowhere does it take the tribes of the Philippine Sea or the Donbass, and set them inside a prophecy about the last days. It does that, specifically, by name, by lineage, only for the region we have spent tonight examining. Wars and rumors of wars are the background noise of every era humanity has ever lived through. This region, and only this region, is named in Scripture as something else entirely. Not the noise, the stage. That, in the end, is the answer to the question a careful skeptic should ask. The Middle East is not the only place shaking tonight. But it may be the only place the text was ever actually pointing at. Ezekiel and Isaiah are not alone in this fixation. Zechariah, writing in the same era, calls Jerusalem a cup that leaves every nation who drinks from it unsteady, a stone too heavy to lift without injury. Joel describes a valley of decision, where the nations are gathered for one final reckoning. Language John picks up centuries later in Revelation, describing armies converging on a place called Armageddon, with Jerusalem, once again, standing quietly at the center. What is striking is not any single verse taken alone. It is that across nearly 1,000 years, written by different authors, under different empires, in different centuries that never overlapped, the same coordinates keep returning. This land, these tribal names, this city, even these same trade routes, the same anxious merchants. Not a single event told once and closed, a trajectory. Exile, then return. Coalition, then confrontation. Building patiently towards something the text simply calls the day of the Lord. Whether or not you take these as literal, forward-looking predictions, it is difficult to deny that the pattern sits there on the page, named with a precision ancient literature almost never attempts. And it is harder still to deny that 26 centuries later, the same names, Persia, Sheba, Dedan, Kedar, Jerusalem, are still the names sitting at the very top of tonight's news. If this is the first time you've heard Sheba, Dedan, and Kedar tied this directly to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, say so in the comments below. Tell us which detail surprised you most tonight. We read every one of them. Here is where history owes us a little humility. For roughly 2,000 years, believers have confidently announced the final generation, and the record of those predictions is not, by any measure, flattering. A long parade of certain preachers, calculated dates, calendars quietly reprinted the following year with a new circle drawn on a different page. But the warning against setting a date does not come from skeptics standing outside the text. It comes from inside it. In that same passage in Matthew, Jesus tells his own disciples plainly not to be alarmed by wars, because, in his own words, the end is not yet. Built directly into the prophecy itself is a caution against exactly the kind of headline-matching enthusiasm a topic like this one tends to invite. So, the honest position sits somewhere between two extremes, neither of them comfortable. It is not nothing that the ancestral names in Ezekiel and Isaiah line up this precisely with this week's coalition of nations, or that the trade collapse fear running through Ezekiel and Revelation mirrors almost exactly the anxiety currently moving oil markets over a 21-mile strait. And it is not proof, either, that we have reached the final page. What the text offers is a trajectory, not a countdown clock. Recognizing a pattern is not the same thing as declaring a finish line. The prophets themselves, notably, never once gave a date. They gave a shape. So where does that leave us? Watching smoke rise over a province most people could not have found on a map a week ago. We will not end tonight by declaring this is it. The moment history quietly assembles itself into confirmation. That kind of certainty claims more than the evidence or the text itself can honestly carry. What we can say is this: the nations named in Ezekiel and Isaiah, Persia, Sheba, Dedan, Kedah, Israel, are not ancient abstractions gathering dust in a footnote. They are the nations making headlines tonight under the same ancestral map the Bible assigned them 26 centuries ago, tracing back to a single family first recorded in Genesis. Ukraine burns. The South China Sea tightens incident by incident. But of all the fires lit across this earth right now, only one of them was ever named by ancestry in a prophecy about the last days. If the biblical writers were right about where this region is heading, then a missile strike on a quiet province called Najran is not simply a regional security story, filed away and forgotten by next week's news cycle. It is a page in a story that opened in Genesis, named its players before any modern border ever existed, and by its own account has not yet reached its final chapter. Tonight's page was written in Najran. Nobody, honestly, can tell you how many pages remain.